So this afternoon, I welcome you. We're going to be talking about preaching in a wired world. And one of the things that we know today is that we are more wired than we have been at any other point in history. Technology has been a part of our lives throughout our existence. Some sort of technology, whether that was the wheel or that was writing or that was plowing and instruments for farming, technology has impacted our lives throughout history. What's happening today is our technology is very personal, it's intrinsic, and it's absolutely with us on a regular basis. And so what we're going to talk about in the next little bit is ways that our wired world is impacting us and how it can also really be impactful in the ways that we preach. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is the fact that technology is really important. It's an important way that we teach. It's an important way that we learn. In classrooms, there was a long time ago, my mother can remember having little individual chalkboards, right? And having a little chalk piece and writing things and showing them to the teacher. My son uses his smartphone in his classrooms. He has some classrooms that have smart boards where kids are typing and writing things and they're showing up on the board. They're manipulating items on a computer screen and they're going up on the board for everybody to see. Technology is a part of how we learn. It's a part of how we communicate with each other. And the way that it's been so impactful in our lives means that in our preaching it's also going to have a place. And I think that's really, really important. One of the things I've learned, though, is it's not generational. Right? I have some older members in some of the churches that I go to, the church that I actually attend in Chestnut Hill, will have their cell phones out and are tweeting and texting and doing all kinds of stuff during church. And some of our younger members are like, could we have more liturgy? Could we have a few more like smells and bells? Could we have, chants and things like that in worship? So making assumptions about who is in our context and who might like more technology and who might not is not going to be helpful the way we might assume that it can be at times. And so one of the things that Schultz wrote a book called High Tech Worship, and I've taken a couple of things from this, but also Tech Sample, who was my social church and society professor at St. Paul School of Theology, and Lynn Sweet, who's written a number of books, who was my professor at Drew, talks about this shift that we've taken from an oral culture to a written culture, and now we're in a wired culture. And right now, owning that, we need to participate in that as much as we can, I think is a really important thing for us as preachers. So we're in this electronic culture. There's all kinds of computer technologies that help us both in worship, in music, in preaching, in teaching, and I think it's a really, really important time for us to sort of think about how we do that. When I talk to my students, I talk about people of my parents' generation were people of the book. When my parents go someplace, they carry extra books with them because they read a book. They open it up. They dog-ear the pages. My dad uses a bookmark from his college recruiting or college foundation recruitment drive from 1989. He still has that bookmark that he uses in all of his books. He has the entire collection of Louis L'Amour books. Everything Louis L'Amour has ever written, my dad has a hard copy of. And he carries books with him wherever he goes. I don't. I read at least a book a week, but my books are on a Kindle or they're on my smartphone. And so my parents are people of the book. I'm a person of the screen. But I was sort of raised in that in-between time period. When I went to school, we had textbooks that we carried around, lugged around. My son can go on his smartphone and access every one of his textbooks from school. So when he rides the train back and forth from school every morning and every afternoon, he can do his homework on his smartphone. It's a totally different way of looking at things. So we're in this culture where we have people of the book sitting in the same pew as people of the screen, trying to figure out where to incorporate wired technology and where not to, I think is a really important thing. And it comes down to context, how we figure out when we use this and when we utilize it. So one of the things that I think is important is to remember that we can't make assumptions. We have to know our context and determine whether or not technology works in our context. At my former church, one of the things we did is we had texting Sundays once a quarter. And we were lucky that we had some people who were members of our congregation, that we had like 5 or 6 preachers who were members of the congregation. And one of the things we did is on those texting Sundays, we had one of our preachers whose phone number was in the bulletin that week. And anytime you had a question, anyone in the church had a question, they could text the preacher and ask the question. So it wasn't one of the preachers that was preaching or participating in the service. It was one of the members or one of the non-preaching or leading pastors that day. And I remember distinctly the first Sunday that I did it. We're a church that has about 75 to 100 in worship. And in that hour and 15-minute block, which is about how long our worship lasts, I got 97 text messages. And they ranged from simple questions, like why do we only have 2 candles on the altar instead of 3 or 4? Why is there only 2? Well, luckily, I have a liturgy degree from Drew, and I learned that. In the old days, when you didn't have electricity, it took 2 lumens to illuminate a page in a space. And so 2 candles lit up the page enough that you could read it in a non-electrified space. That's why we have 2 candles. Now, people have tried to attach meaning to it. They've said it represents the Old and the New Testament, or it represents, the Old and the New, or, there are all different kinds of things that we'll attribute to it. But this person just wanted to know, why 2 candles? Maybe they'd wondered that for a long time and never had an opportunity to ask that question. Another question I got was from an 8-year-old little kid, and he was using his grandmother's phone. The reason I know that is because when I got the message, I looked up, and this little 8-year-old kid named Joshua was going, "That's from me, that's from me, that's from me." So I knew it was from him. And the question said, the preacher was preaching about forgiveness, and the question said, "My brother makes me mad. How do I forgive him?" Now, he was connecting to what was going on in the sermon because he knew the topic was forgiveness. Yes. Now, he couldn't ask, or didn't think he could ask, the preacher during that moment, how do I forgive specifically my brother who made me mad today? But we had an outlet for him that day because we had a texting Sunday. And he bumps his grandmother's arm and says, "Can I use your smartphone?" She hands it to him and puts in my phone number that's in the bulletin, and he writes the question. How do I forgive my brother who made me mad today? And I texted back, the first thing you can say is just, "I forgive you." And then try to find ways to show him that you love him anyway. And try to make sure he knows that it hurts your feelings, but that he's still your brother. And he texted back and said, "All right, I'll try it, but I still hate him." Now, it's true. I mean, it's just a real raw emotion that was happening in that moment. 3-4 months later, I'm one of the texting persons again, and I got a message. We were talking about, the preacher was preaching that particular day. The theme was repentance and repenting for what you have done. It was during Lent, and this woman, and I know it's a woman because of the way she asked the question, she said, "My husband has hurt me. Never physically, but emotionally for 27 years. And he's always told me it's my fault, that I deserved it. How do I forgive myself for believing it? How do I repent of the sin that I have allowed to be put on me?" And I was sitting there going, how do I respond to this? Because one, I didn't feel like she had done anything sinful. I didn't think there was anything she needed to repent for. But there was this embedded theology there that she's trying to resonate, and she's doing it in characters on her phone. She's typing this message to me. And I'm thinking, if this is the first time she's ever owned up to this, she's doing it in an impersonal way, on texting, but it's safe for her. She knows who's on the other end of that message. And at one point, I tried not to make eye contact with her during the service. I tried to glance every once in a while, and she wasn't looking my direction. After the service, I sort of made my way back to that part of the church, but not too close. And she walked by and she put her arm around me and she said, "I'm working on it," and walked away. And I knew that she had reached out in a way that she had never reached out before. And I had basically said to her in my text, 1, you didn't do anything to deserve this. 2, you have nothing to repent. 3, he does not deserve you. You are a powerful, profound person, and I want you to know that God loves you and does not intend for this to be your relationship. And I said several other things to her. And over the course of the next year, she and I have connected on a couple of occasions. We've had coffee, and it all started because of a texting Sunday. And the reason, she told me months later when we were at Starbucks having coffee, she said the reason she was able to do it is because in that initial text, she didn't have to tell me who she was. I didn't know the number. It just came across as a number that I had never dialed. The number came up, but I didn't know who she was. I knew it was a woman in the room, and I was trying to see if anyone made eye contact with me, and nobody did. But afterwards, that glance, that arm around my shoulders saying, "I'm working on it," I knew. And over the next year, she and I have connected in a really powerful way, and it all started because of a text message. So understanding that people embrace things differently depending on who they are is a really powerful thing. That texting, we thought it was just going to be the youth that were going to use the texting Sundays. But it's all ages, from 8-year-old kids to this woman is a 62-year-old woman who has been in a marriage for 27 years that's been abusive. And finally, over the last few months, has found the strength to leave that relationship. And it is a powerful thing to watch her new life unfold in front of us in the ways that she is blossoming. It wasn't about me. It was about the medium. It was about the opportunity to use a technology that she was comfortable with and share something in a way that was non-threatening in the moment. That's a powerful thing to think about. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is the power of social media, right? Nearly everyone is a part of some element of social media today. They may not actively be on it, but they know kids are on it, their kids or their grandkids are on it, and they have found out things through social media. There's a number of social media outlets, and the most common ones are probably Facebook and Twitter. There are also things like YouTube and Vimeo for videos. There's Google. There's a number of them. I could just go on and on and on. I could come up with another slide that probably has 50 of these. When you go on social media sites, depending on what country you're in, there are multiple social media platforms, and anything that you want to participate in, you can. There are social media that's simply image-driven, that are Instagram, Flickr, places where you share images with each other. But there are also news sites like Twitter and Reddit and places like that where you get up-to-date news and analysis of what's going on. And then you have social sites like Facebook that are letting you interact with folks that you didn't actually know. Joel and I have actually been Facebook friends for a while, but we had not really had a conversation together face-to-face until today, even though we had met last fall. But he and I have been Facebook friends, and when he walked up to me today, he said, "Congratulations on your wedding," because he saw it on my Facebook feed. And so there's this level of conversation that can take place out in social media that's different. And it's a way of getting to know each other and a level of understanding that can sometimes feel very fake and unreal, but it can also have some really profound connections, and I'm going to share a little bit about that in a little bit. This is what happens in an internet minute, all right? I'm not going to go through all of it. There's a lot of stuff on this screen, but basically there's over almost 640,000 gigabytes of data that is transferred every minute on the internet, right? That is a ton of data. On YouTube, for every minute, there is 30 hours of video uploaded. In every minute, 30 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube. It is just an enormous stockholder of video files. Facebook, there are almost 300,000 logins every minute. and 6 million views of Facebook data. That's in a minute. It's just phenomenal what's going on. You have 1,300 new mobile users every minute. There's 204 million emails that are sent, but email is even becoming passé. At many college campuses today, they don't even assign emails anymore. Used to, when you went to college, you automatically got a college email account. Many universities don't do that anymore. They do text blasts, or they do Twitter messages, or they have an online mobile site like a Moodle or a Blackboard. They have learning platforms that students go to, and they get all their messages there, because many young folks, they wouldn't even know how to send an email. And we thought email was, the great new thing in communication a couple of decades ago. So lots of stuff going on in the internet, constantly evolving, constantly changing. In every single minute, there's 100,000 tweets that get sent out on Twitter. What's interesting is all of this internet growth, all of these changes, is pretty staggering. The number on the bottom, which is hard for you to see, but let me read it for you. Today, the number of network devices is equal to the entire global population. Now, this slide was done in 2013, and they were estimating then that by 2015, the number of network devices would be 2 times the global population. In my household alone, we have 3 smartphones. There's 3 of us. We have 4 laptops. We have 2 tablets and a desktop. Some of those are work tablets and but all of those devices are on network. They're all capable of going online. They're also capable of going offline. One of the things that we did this last week on our honeymoon is we turned off our phone notifications. On your phone, it tells you when Facebook gets a comment. It tells you when you get a new email. I turned off all the notifications. I had my phone to take pictures because my cell phone takes better pictures than any of the cameras that I've ever owned. We didn't have any of that email and stuff like that coming in. I checked 2 times because I knew I had events coming up this week and I had to teach. And I sent out 3 emails in the entire week. Other than that, I didn't get networked at all. We didn't even go online at the hotel. It was fabulous because I'm one of those people who is connected all the time. But to be able to unconnect was a really powerful thing. So then the question becomes, if we're this connected, is church a moment that we should disconnect and not allow technology and mobile networking? Is it a moment where we say to people, you're connected all the time, let's disconnect now? Or do we say, this is a part of your life and the way that you interact and connect with the world, maybe we should incorporate it into our worship so that it becomes seamless and worship becomes a part of that, the way that you live anyway? That's a really important question. And if I had an answer that fit every single context, I'd give it to you. But I don't. There are Sundays in my church where we have texting Sundays. And there are Sundays when we use video clips and we use screens. And there are Sundays when we have no technology anywhere visible. We try to vary it so that people get attuned to the fact that, all right, this is a no technology Sunday. We're going to have a very low tech Sunday, and we're just going to communicate and really connect with each other face to face. And then other Sundays we'll be texting and tweeting, and we'll send out messages. We try to attune to what's going on in the flavor of that service, the tone of that service, the need of that particular topic, and connect it to what's going on technology-wise so that we're being, true to people's needs. There is no place in our sanctuary where you can't get connected if you want to. We have increased the bandwidth in our sanctuary so that people who want to get online can. But we also encourage some Sundays to have a quiet, contemplative worship service, and we encourage people not to go online. And the response has been phenomenal. There have been people who said, I really needed to disconnect today, and the fact that we turned off the Wi-Fi, on a particular Sunday was really helpful because people couldn't go online. There are those Sundays when we have a low-tech Sunday, we put a notice up on the door that says Wi-Fi is disconnected today for a low-tech service. And, you know, if people want to use their cell coverage, they can. So they still can get connected, but we turn off our Wi-Fi on some Sundays just because we want to just breathe and just be. But we're not going to deny people who they are. And so trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? Do we immerse and embrace it, or do we pull back from it? I think we do a little of each. We figure out ways to make it work when we can, and we also figure out ways to disconnect and help people disconnect as well. This is what the internet looked like in 1996. That's ESPNet, right? That's the Sports Zone. Houston Rockets. All right, this is what the internet looked like. It was very, very two-dimensional. It was not very active. There were links to stories, but there were not video clips on it. Today, when you go on an internet source, there are multiple things that we're seeing on a regular basis. As I said, we're no longer people of the book. Most of us were people of the screen. When you go onto an internet source, there are at least 26 images that are vying for your attention at any given moment on the screen. All the different banners, and this is true of TV as well. So there's ads, there's apps, there's all of these things that are happening. When I watch CNN, the same thing is true. At any given point, there are 17 to 21 different images that are vying for my visual attention when I watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. Any of those outlets, they've got a banner running underneath. They've got the NASDAQ and the stock exchange. They've got the time. They've got sports scores that are going on. They have the anchor person. They have data that's going on. They have the logo. There's multiple things that are going on at once. And all of those things are vying for our attention. Well, in worship, we got to figure out how many things can people adapt to at one time. Is it a screen and the preacher? Is it a screen up front and the screen in their hand? How do we figure out how many screens are appropriate? How do we figure out how to get their attention? This was huge in 1996. People thought that was the coolest thing ever. Now, if you clicked on a site that that looked like that, you would think you were back in 1996. And there are lots of churches whose web pages look exactly like that, that still look like that, that are dead, that have very little color, that doesn't have any streaming video, doesn't have any video links, doesn't have any life to it. Using media means being attentive to what it needs to look like and how people are relating to it. If I look at CNN and there's 17 different images, and then I look at your web page and there's one static page, and it's the pastor's letter for this month that's the first thing on the page, I'm going to go completely away from your website within about 4 seconds, because that's how long you have to get somebody. 4 seconds. On the web, if you want to capture someone's attention, you have 4 seconds to capture their attention or they're gone, because their finger is hovering on that click to get away from it. And if you don't do something that that keeps them or makes them want to stay there, they're going to get out of there quickly. We cannot continue to use 1996 technology and ways of thinking in a 2015 world. So what does social media look like? Well, this is social media explained using donuts, all right? So if you're on Twitter, you're going to use a hashtag. Some of you have seen hashtags, it's the numeral sign. And so that lets you follow a topic on Twitter. And Twitter is 140 characters that allow you to capture news and to share something quickly. So if I'm on social media and I'm talking about donuts, on Twitter, I'm going to say I'm eating a hashtag donut. On Facebook, I like donuts, because on Facebook you can like and comment and do all kinds of stuff. On Foursquare, which is kind of dead, it's Swarm and several other things that are geographic apps that will tell you where you are. And so you can, Yelp and several other things, you can do that now. So you click in and you say, I'm at LTSP. And everybody on their social media knows where you are. I don't like using that all the time. I don't like people knowing where I am all the time. But if I'm eating the donuts on Foursquare, this is where I'm eating donuts. Instagram, here's a vintage photo of my donut. on Instagram and several other of those photo sharing sites, what they have is the ability to do different kinds of photographic imagery to change what it looks like. YouTube, here I am eating a donut, and you upload your video. LinkedIn, my skills include donut eating. LinkedIn is a networking site mainly for folks who are professionals. There are as many people joining LinkedIn every single day as the entire population of the Ivy League schools in the U.S. That's how many people are going on to LinkedIn, so it's a professional. Pinterest, here's a donut recipe. Last FM, there's lots of different music sites today, Spotify, different music sites. Now I'm listening to Donuts the Song. Google Plus, I'm a Google employee who eats donuts because nobody is on Google Plus. Nobody is on Google Plus. So this is just sort of an explanation of social media. It gives it a little idea of how it's being used. But one of the things we know is that people have their phones with them all the time. This is a survey that was done. This was in 2014, I believe. And they asked the question, can you recall the last time your phone was not within earshot? Now, 17% said 3 hours or more their phone was away from them. 25% said they could never recall when it was not close to me. So 1 in 4 people couldn't even remember a moment when the phone wasn't with them. 63% of smartphone owners keep their phone with them all but an hour of their working day. 79% keep their phone with them all but 2 hours a day. We sleep with it right by our bed. If an email comes in at the middle of the night, we answer it. We are no longer people who get rest and relaxation and rejuvenation from having time away. We are constantly clicking on that little phone, which is why when we went away this last week, we turned off the notifications. We turned off the media so that we weren't getting messages from people. We just wanted to be together. And that's a powerful thing, to disconnect. And I think that one of the reasons folks come even more religiously on low-tech Sundays in our church is because they want that moment to disconnect. But it depends, you know. There's some people who are like that whole time. They're sitting there going, "Wait a minute, I still have to have my phone." You know, it's like their trigger finger itching, right? They can't get away from it. It's so addictive. And I think one of the things we have to help people do is to disconnect when we can. So I think there's a healthy balance. There are moments when we can embrace this, and there are moments when I think we can help people put it down. Now, one of the bad things about social media is that we perpetuate a lot of stupidity out there. This is a picture where the father looks at the son and is telling him something, and the son looks back and says, "Yes, sir, I shared something on Facebook without checking facts and encouraged bullshit to propagate, leading to the dumbing down of humanity." Yeah, there are kittens in the picture. I apologize for the language, but that's what's happening. We share stuff on a regular basis that just isn't true. So one of the great things about social media is that I can connect to a woman in the southeastern part of Australia. I have no idea how we connected. Her name is Suzanne. Probably about 7 years ago, a friend of a friend of a friend posted something that I had written on a blog. And Suzanne saw it from her friend's friend, and she sent me a private message and said, "I am agoraphobic. I'm someone who will not go out of my house. I live in the southeastern part of Australia. I haven't been to church in 30 years. And I have not received communion in 30 years. My pastor will not come to the church, bring the elements from the church to me." And first, I was just heartbroken that the pastor was not willing to do that. And she and I began having this conversation. It started 7 years ago, and probably once a month or so, Suzanne and I have a conversation on Facebook. Just Facebook message. She'll send me a note and say, "Hey, how are you?" And I'll send a message to her. And one of the things that happened as a response to this conversation is I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Australia. And I said, do you know any pastors who live in this particular region of Australia? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, well, I know this woman. She hasn't told me what denomination she is because she knows that I know what part of Australia she lives in. I know what town she lives in now. And she knows if she tells me the denomination, I can figure out who the pastor is. So she's being very circumspect. I said, do you know someone who either vacations in that area or could go to that area? And she said, sure, I do. And so I messaged Suzanne and I said, listen, would you be willing to receive a visitor on Thursday afternoon? And she said, yeah, who is it? And I said, it's a friend of mine's friend who's a pastor, and he's going to bring you communion. And I could hear the weeping through her message. Do you know? I mean, she's typing to me, but I could hear her weeping. And this friend had her friend take communion to Suzanne. It was the first time in 33 years that she had received communion. And it was profoundly important for her because she had lost faith in the church. And a connection through social media allowed Suzanne to receive communion. And she has continued to receive communion from that pastor. And Suzanne says that if she does get the strength and the courage to leave the house, it will be because that man has reached out to her and become her friend. Social media can be a great thing. We also say crap that we wouldn't say anywhere else or to anyone else. We share stuff that's not true. We say stuff because we feel anonymous and we can say things and get away with it. But social media can be a powerful tool in our preaching. I talked earlier about crowdsourcing. And one of the things we can do with Facebook or Twitter is to ask people in our church, how have you experienced the grace of God? What does communion mean to you? When was the last time someone reached out and really loved you in a way that changed your life? Well, now, I asked that question a couple of months ago for a sermon that I was preparing, and Suzanne sent me a message. And she said, you know dang well what communion means to me and when someone reached out and changed my life. And it was just the power of social media and the connections that were there that allowed that to happen. That's pretty powerful. This is one of my favorite cartoons about texting. Jesus is up on the mountain praying before his death. The disciples are supposed to be down there waiting for him. He returns and finds them and he says, you're texting. Can you not even keep watch for an hour without texting? Well, that's what my church is trying to ask. We're trying to say, when are those moments where we need to not incorporate this at all? And when are those moments where we can use it and utilize it in really powerful ways that help people lead forward? But I think social media has been around for a long time. Images and written words, as far back as the early scrolls of the church. That's social media. It's sharing. It's people of the book, but it's also people of the early screen that shared what was going on in the life of the church with each other. Twitter, as I said, is 140 characters. And it's one of the fastest growing social media platforms on the planet. And there's a couple of groups that are causing this. One is people between the ages of 55 and 64. That's amazing. That is the fastest growing group on Twitter. It's grown 79% in the last 3 years. On Facebook, the fastest growing group is 45 to 54. The second group that's growing exponentially on Twitter is Black Twitter. Black Twitter is a subset of Twitter that is African American scholars, African American activists, African American pastors, and African American persons who are sharing things about their own experience and what's going on in Black Lives Matter, after Ferguson, after Baltimore, after Trayvon Martin, and it has become a hugely powerful source of information. I didn't learn about Michael Brown from CNN or MSNBC or any news outlet. I learned about Michael Brown from Black Twitter. And I learned about Michael Brown within an hour of Michael Brown being shot in Ferguson, Missouri, because people started tweeting about Michael Brown, and within an hour, it was on Twitter, and I was getting updated notices because I have a number of friends and colleagues who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement, who are African American scholars and academics, and folks who are in the social media platforms that are helping elicit responses and trying to help prophetic witness about what's happening in the world around them. And it's a huge plus for all of us trying to figure out what's going on in the world around racism, around class, around sexism. And the easy thing about Twitter is you can follow any hashtag. And so I can just click on Black Lives Matter and I can see everything that's scrolling in that moment about Black Lives Matter. As soon as I started seeing things about Michael Brown, there was a hashtag that started, hashtag Michael Brown. And I could click on that and just follow what was coming in. And just like any other, like the cartoon I just showed you a couple of minutes ago, some of the early reports were inaccurate. Some of them were not clear, but I got a sense of the anger and the frustration from those posts so that it happened on a Saturday night. I could address it Sunday morning. It really didn't make the news media for several days, but there were lots of us who knew it was happening because of Black Twitter, because of following the hashtag Michael Brown, because we had been following Black Lives Matter and several other resources. We knew what was happening out there. So two really fast-growing demographic groups. One is middle-aged folks, and the other is African Americans who are really using Twitter in a lot of different powerful ways. Facebook, I think, is a really good source to share what's going on in our lives. I taught a class last summer that was about social media and preaching, and one of the things I had my students do is I had them do like a 45-second trailer for their coming sermons. And it was like, on Tuesday, this is what I'm thinking about preaching on Sunday. And they just did a little, video of themselves talking about what was coming up that Sunday. And so one of the students was doing a sermon about Black Lives Matter. And she did a 30 to 45-second video clip just saying, this Sunday we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter. And one of the things I want you to know is this is going to be a hard conversation, but it's a conversation we have to have. And yes, we're a predominantly white congregation, but we have to have these conversations about Black Lives Matter. And I hope you'll join me on Sunday. And I hope that if you don't, it's not because we're talking about Black Lives Matter. And I mean, they had droves of people show up for church that week, and they said, we saw that little 40-second video clip. She uploaded it to their church's Facebook page and said, this is what we're talking about Sunday. Give a listen. And folks knew what was happening, and they showed up in droves to have this conversation. And they had a forum after church so they could talk about Black Lives Matter and talk about racism. And it started a conversation in her predominantly white church about white privilege, about Black lives, about racism, and about violence in America that has continued to this day. They're still having these very important conversations. And she got them there by using her Facebook page. So really powerful stuff. There's 1 million websites that have integrated with Facebook today. And so one of the things is that you get constant ads and you get constant input from folks about what's happening on in the world outside. And so I like a lot of news sites. I keep up with a lot of news through my social media. And so I follow those pages on Facebook. And so I'll get a running dialogue both in Twitter and Facebook of what's happening. But one of the things I find really interesting is the statement up on the upper right-hand side. 23% of users check their accounts, their Facebook accounts, 5 times or more a day. So they're constantly updating and seeing what's going on in the lives of their friends and colleagues. Now, sometimes that's like my friend Paul. Paul has never eaten a meal that he didn't take a picture of and post on Facebook. I mean, everything he eats is the best meal he's ever had, and he clicks a picture of it and he posts it on Facebook. So I know what Paul's eaten every day for like the past, 4 years. I don't really need to know what Paul eats, But he has this weird fascination with food pictures. All right, do that. I can follow him or unfollow him. I don't have to look at his food pictures. But a couple of weeks ago, my niece was injured, and her Facebook feed told me that she had been hurt before my sister had a chance to tell me. Now, it wasn't a bad injury. She's fine, but it was scary for a little while. And so I was able to reach out to my sister and say, hey, is my niece okay? Is everything all right? Are you okay? And when she picked up the phone, she said, how do you know what's going on? I haven't even told anybody yet. Well, one of my niece's friends posted on Facebook, please pray for, this friend of mine. And she tagged her friend. Well, even though I'm not friends with her friend, because I'm friends with my niece, I got notification of that. And folks started praying. And by the time those messages stopped coming through, there was like 200 people had liked that post and said they were praying for my niece. That's powerful. It happens with world events. It happens with local events. It can happen with one, health scare for a 20-year-old kid who's away at college and whose mom is 150 miles away and can't get there fast enough. To know that people are holding her kid in prayer. And to know that because we're connected to each other and we go on Facebook so many times a day, people could update and figure out what was happening. That's powerful. It can also be addictive, and it can be distracting, and it can pull us out of our real-world lives, but it can also be a way that we connect to each other in really profound ways. All right, crowdsourcing. We talked about this a little bit. And so what they're doing is they're using either crowdsourcing, some people call it cloud sourcing, I call it crowdsourcing. And the question that we ask can be woven into our sermon, or we can use it as background information. Like I said, a couple of months ago, I was preaching on the sacraments, and I asked people, what do the sacraments mean for you? What does the Eucharist mean for you? And I got the message from Suzanne, but I got messages from other people about the baptism of their child. And one of the stories that got told to me was by a mom who had had a stillborn baby. And she knew in her tradition that there's no baptism for stillborn babies. But she had grown up Catholic. And the first probably 10, 15 years of her life, she had grown up Catholic. And something that had ingrained in her mind was that baby was not saved, and so that baby was not going to go to heaven. And even though her current tradition, which was Methodist, was of a tradition that said we do not baptize stillborn babies, she called her pastor, and she said, I know that this is probably the wrong thing to ask for, but would you come to the hospital and baptize my baby? And the pastor was smart enough to know that sometimes pastoral care trumps polity, right? Often it ought to trump. And he went to the hospital and he baptized her stillborn baby boy. And they buried that child knowing that he was baptized. And when I asked that question, she sent me a message. And she said, I want you to know that I can't tell you how I would have felt had the preacher said no because he said yes. But I can tell you that we buried our first stillborn child 7 years ago, and no one would baptize him. This was our second, and it feels different because someone said the sacrament for you is more important than the polity of our church. And she shared that story through social media. And I said, that's a powerful thing. I'm so glad that you shared it. I'm sorry you've experienced this, but I'm so glad your pastor did this for you. And she said that they were at the hospital. And they had been posting updates that they were at the hospital. The baby was hopefully coming that day, and she was in labor, and then the baby died and during childbirth, and so the baby was born dead. And she said her pastor knew because he had been on Facebook. And so when he got the phone call, he was more prepared because he knew it had happened. That's power, right? I mean, there's profound power in that, and I think we have to acknowledge and at least be aware that the ways that we connect to each other through social media and technology can be really, really pivotal in moments of crisis, and it can give us an opportunity to really connect to each other in some profound ways. Now, here's a couple of examples. Have you had a negative experience with someone talking about the Bible with you? I grew up in Texas, so yes, I've had a negative experience of people talking about the Bible with me. How's your understanding of grace changed? So these kind of questions, just throwing them out there. And you could do crowdsourcing at a Bible study. You know, you could ask people ahead of time, you know, how have you understood grace? Or how have you understood, you know, justification? Or how do you understand the role of the church today? And people, that then becomes a part of your writing. If you're writing music, it becomes a part of the liturgy. If you're writing liturgy, it becomes a part of your preaching. And all of this really becomes a really helpful asset to people who are in the pews, because they begin to hear pieces of their story. And they're like, I shared that on Facebook and it's in his sermon. You know, I shared that in Facebook, and I always ask permission if I'm going to use it. And so I say, you know, if you would like for me to know your story, in the post I'll say, if you're okay with sharing this, share it on the page. But if you want to tell me something private and don't want me to share it, but you want me to know, please feel free to send me a private message. And so people have the option of doing one or the other. And then anytime I decide to incorporate someone's story, I'll send them a message privately and say, you posted this on my page, I'm thinking about using it in my sermon. Is it okay if I use that? You know, I won't use your name, or I'll use, you know, a pseudonym or something like that. And I've very rarely had anyone who shared it publicly say you can't use it. But it's just one of those things to sort of check in and be aware of that. So crowdsourcing, trying to help people connect with what you're doing, I think is a really leading and important way to use media, to use what's going on in the world around us, to use technology. The last thing I want to share with you is an app, an application, a website that you can use to actually get live feedback during your sermon or during your teaching. And it's called Poll Everywhere. And the web page is at the bottom. It's polleverywhere.com. And you can actually create a poll while you're doing a sermon or doing a Sunday school lesson or teaching an adult forum. You can create a poll, and then people can respond. And they can respond either by tweeting into a particular, to a location. They can go on the website and type directly into the poll, or you can text using a number on the poll. And you can have the responses come up live while you're doing your presentation. And so I had a student last year who was doing a sermon about what we're afraid of. And so he did a poll everywhere and had people type in what it was that they were afraid of, right? And so the thing started scrolling up. And there were things like, I'm afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of snakes. I'm afraid of dying alone. I'm afraid of never meeting the person who God intends for me. I'm afraid of never being ordained in the church that I feel called to. I'm afraid of losing my mother who's fighting cancer right now. And there were some amazing responses. So as he was preaching, he began incorporating the things that were coming up on the poll. And you can have them come out as straight responses. You can have them come up as wordles, which is word art. There's all different ways that you can do it. I've seen musicians use it. I've seen preachers use it. There's a lot of different resources out there that we can use. And the thing is to determine where it works and when it works and if it works in your particular context. And so I go to a church that uses texting Sundays and uses video screens and also uses low-tech Sundays. And I've been in sanctuaries that had no possibility of doing any kind of networked or wired stuff because they have very little cell signal at all. I was at a little church in central Pennsylvania I guess it was about 2 years ago, and you couldn't even get a cell signal there. So tweeting or texting was pretty much impossible. But we could have networked conversations by having people turn in their pews and talk to each other or respond to each other. So there's a lot of different ways that we can incorporate sort of this wired, connected reality that we live in today. Some of it's really high-tech and some of it's really low-tech. But figuring out what works for your context is really important. So when I go into a place, I ask. I say, do you have screens? Do you use screens? Do you use technology in your church? Do your people text? Do you have technology that you use on a regular basis? If they don't, I don't try to do something that's not going to be possible. But I've walked into churches that have a QR code, right? You know, the little code that you see on advertisements? It's a little block that has black and white squares on it. You take a picture of it, and it takes you to a PDF, or it takes you to a website. I've walked in churches that had a QR code as you walked in the sanctuary, and you download the bulletin right there as you walk in. And it's on your smartphone or on your tablet. You don't print out anything. And I walked in churches that had no technology whatsoever, but they were just as connected to each other because they were hardwired by caring about each other and learning about each other and listening to each other. So the thing about preaching in a wired world is that there are ways that we can incorporate social media, technology, and we can incorporate the dickens out of it. I mean, we can have bells and whistles and all kinds of screens and, everything you can possibly imagine. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a better worship service or people are going to experience God more. It's how we use the tools that we have. It's how we utilize the materials and the resources that we have and create opportunities for folks to connect to the divine. That's what's important. But in this day and age, asking the question, how are we going to use technology is very important. So I hope you'll think about it in your context, figure out, maybe one Sunday you have the youth help lead a texting Sunday. Maybe another Sunday you put an image up on a screen, just a screen you bring up from downstairs. Maybe you just use a piece of art on an easel. But figure out ways to incorporate images, ways to incorporate media, social media, to use it before your sermons and even after your sermons, after your worship. What'd you connect with today? What'd you take away with you today? And figure out ways to use this wired technology, this wired social media reality in the way that augments the story of the gospel. Because we got the greatest story out there, right? I mean, we have this amazing story of Jesus Christ. And telling it the way we've always told it isn't necessarily connecting with this new generation. So figuring out ways to tell it and ways that they connect to, that's what we have to do. I just think that's imperative. So thank y'all for coming today. All right? Yay! All right, so let's see. Do we have any questions?
When you were talking about this poll, for example, and having people respond to you,
Yeah.
that's on your getting from them. How are you getting to them? Are you live streaming? What are you doing?
Yeah, well, you can do a number of different things. So one is you put the poll in so if you're going to do a live poll, you put it on the screen ahead of time so that folks can begin to plug into it. You put it in your bulletin or resources so they know how to get there, right? You can put it on your Facebook page ahead of time, and people can begin to respond at any point. Once you put the link up there and people start responding, the link is live. So it'll have all the responses, whether they come in 2 days ahead of time or 2 days after.
So I'm up preaching and looking at the screen.
I can have the screen. So as I'm walking, as I'm preaching, I can look and say, here are things that are right here in this room you're afraid of today. Think about how powerful it is to just share what we're afraid of, right? Or any kind of responses. You can either do true false things. You can do questions about how many of you have ever been to a funeral of a person of a different culture than you, and have a chart, a graph go up right there live. So it can help you in your teaching. It can help you in just helping people see visually what you're talking about and how they can respond to it. So it's an audience participation thing.
So to do that, though, who does the chart? Do I have somebody in my congregation?
Yeah, you can have somebody in the congregation that will watch it, but it's just live. And so, once you put it up and you have the directions there, I don't have to do anything.
So Poll Everywhere can tell you
it just goes up. I just put it up on the screen, have my tech person put it up on the screen, and it just, as things go up, it just continues to update live in anything that's up there. I think that one of the things that we know about technology is that whatever technology you use, be prepared for it to mess up. You know, whether you're a musician or a preacher, you're a teacher or whatever, technology has its own mind, and sometimes it works great, and sometimes an amp goes out or the projector doesn't work, and so you always have to have a backup plan, a plan B, a plan C, you know, a punt. I always have a couple of different laptops around so that if something goes down, I can use something else. But yeah, just trying to figure out the resources that are out there. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah. When you, so, you know, say that you create a hashtag for like those, you know, LTSP preaching days or whatever, it creates a really long tail for a specific event that happened on a specific day, like a sermon.
Yeah.
Or, you know, how do you manage that long tail? Do you decide to, you know, how relevant is it, you know, a month from now for a hashtag that's related to a sermon, to a specific topic in a specific community?
Yeah, there's a group of us that are using a hashtag sermon tweets. And so whenever we're preaching or we're listening to sermons, we'll do sermon tweets. And so, you know, I can go on that and I can see sermons that are preached in Maryland or sermons that are preached in Pennsylvania. And there's things like Black Lives Matter and debates and stuff like that that has this longevity to it. And Twitter has the function where you can archive a hashtag, so you can see all the things that have come up on that particular hashtag. I think after a while, many of them sort of lose their, lose their interest, or they lose their relevancy. And so trying to figure out how long do I keep this hashtag going. It's a lot of work. When we have our Tuesday LTSP convocations, it's LTSP Convo. And so you can see the LTSP convos that have happened in the past, and there's a number of students who tweet and post things on Facebook. There's LTSP quotes. Students quote funny and strange things that professors say. They put them up on Twitter and on Facebook. So some things are really specific. Yeah, some things are really specific to that particular context and that particular moment. And I think some have longevity and they need to hang around, and I'll archive those, but others, it's okay if they die out. Yeah. Yeah.
With Christian Ed, you learned that your job is to keep the tangent from going too far. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's putting a bracket around things, and sometimes the bracket's movable, and sometimes you want that bracket to last for a long time. You want to be able to hang on to it, and sometimes it's better not to. Yeah, see, that's a hard one. No, I don't want to do that. But yeah, I mean, there are moments when things have continued to drag out. And one of the things that I always tell when we go to big events and the group doesn't have a hashtag, you know, I'm like, how could you not have a hashtag? You know, and even this place, I was like, do you have a hashtag for today? No, we didn't think about it. Well, we have to think about that. We have to think about ways that we can brand and ways that we can continue people thinking about it. But after a while, you just move on to the next thing. And one of the things that we did at the Academy of Homiletics in San Diego last year, our hashtag was AOH 2014. But the same weekend, the Association of Haberdashers or something was having a convocation somewhere, and we were I was going on AOH 2014, and I was getting, there were texts about hats, and I was like, you guys, we have to change our hashtag. It's not working. We got to get rid of it. So you got to test them. I think they're really helpful, but they have a lifespan that's limited for most of them. Bring Back Our Girls, Black Lives Matter, things like that, I think have staying power, and it's been really helpful to have the consistency of that branding, but there's a lot of them that I think it's okay if they die out. All right, one more question. Yep.
I thank you that for the last 10 minutes you did bring in, for those of us who are used to the rural setting, what do you do whenever there is no signal? So thank you for that. I'm just curious that, this presentation was just a little urban-centric, but
Yeah, well, one of the things that when I was pastoring a rural church, I mean, in the early 1990s, they were more technologically savvy than anybody else because they had GPS satellite guided tractors and all kinds of stuff. They were watching weather systems. I mean, it was old like the old ESPN, screens, but they were more connected than I was back during that time period. So, we can't make assumptions that urban people are connected and rural people are not, because I don't think that's accurate. But we have to know our context, and there are urban churches where you don't get a cell signal, and there are rural churches that have a cell tower in their bell tower, and they are completely connected. So, yeah, it's absolutely contextual. We just have to figure out what works in those particular locations.
And just so there are a few places
Yeah.
back home where if I asked them to Twitter, everyone would have to go out the parking lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all for being here today. Appreciate it.